Now we are.
No, we are now. Okay. I forgot to turn on the recording. I wonder, how do we move that? Charlie, you and Irene, you're not in the picture. So how do we get that to move? Oh, that's it. Oh,
that would be good.
There you go.
There. Perfect. Okay. There. So anyone else want to comment on the video that we watched?
I guess just to repeat what I said last week, Peter, it's becoming more and more common in our diocese for people to use Anglican prayer beads, which are very similar to the Rosary, as a point of focus, an opportunity to get more clarity in their connection with God during their prayers. And I have a set of beads that I use, and they're wonderful, to the point where I've used them so much that if I'm driving now, I don't have to take them out of my pocket, or I don't have to have them with me. I can just recite the prayer, and it gives me the opportunity to take myself to a place where I want to be rather than the place I am, and gives me clarity and focus on what I want to think about rather than what's bothering me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harold. Anyone else want to?
I thought it was interesting when they would said 5% of the American people pray negatively. Negative prayer.
Yeah.
Can't imagine why would you wish, I don't know, negative influence of prayer.
Do they
They're praying to something will happen to somebody else.
Oh,
Negative prayer.
yeah.
I never heard of it before. I never thought of it.
Right?
You know, somebody I jotted down because it really hadn't.
Pretty odd, wasn't it?
And if you can't wish somebody good, why would you wish? Why would you pray for some harm to come to someone? It's unbelievable.
How do you think that is, right?
Did David pray negatively? Oh Lord, kill my enemies, smite them that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, Psalm 139, how many times do we skip over those angry verses and go on to search me, oh God? Right?
Yeah.
And in the next world, we will see ourselves as we really are. Yeah.
Anyone else online, or Charlie?
Sometimes our prayer is answered in a way that we weren't anticipating.
Goodness.
Yeah. Right. There got to be power within that, because if you were just on that straight road and just praying just for that direct thing, we always believe that God takes our interests at His heart, and we hope that He'll make it a best interest for us.
It said there as well, no is an answer.
Anyone else online want to make a comment?
Elizabeth is here.
Yeah, I noticed. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, it is Elizabeth. I'm here.
Yeah, I noticed.
I just want to say that the last week when you guys were talking about this, and I had an equally wonderful experience at a concert in Portland, which is just half an hour away from us, with Yo-Yo Ma. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard him perform, but he's an incredible human being. And we had gotten to know him a little bit because 8 years ago, my daughter had taken a master class with him in Portland. She was one of 3 kids across the state who were chosen to work with him for an hour. And, that 8 years ago, that was a major experience and milestone and event in her life, which she hasn't forgotten. So we took her to see him in the same auditorium where she had performed and worked with him. And I can tell you that it was packed. The auditorium was packed. He was playing with a young pianist, a woman who's not as well known as he is, but she will be now because she's been touring with him. And just his generosity and his humor and his delight in the music and his dedication and his technique, of course. I mean, he's just, incredible. The audience was enthralled. I felt that same thing. That whole audience was just unified in just a sort of transcendent feeling of, wow, we're actually, something is touching us. Just goes way beyond what's happening on the stage. And at the end he did 3 encores, and they were particularly moving for my family because the first one was a song that my mom, who would have just turned 102, used to play all the time when I was growing up. And the last one was a song that my daughter had played at various weddings of sisters that she has performed at. So it was all in all an incredible experience. I thought, prayer is just, I don't know if any of these people feel this as prayer, but I sure did. And I don't know what their religious thoughts or affiliations are, but it didn't matter one bit. The spirit was there, and we all felt it. You could just see in the faces of the people around us. So I would agree. There's a lot of ways that, as community, we can find, that may not be part of the church, but boy, would it be nice to have the church be part of it.
Yes. Anyone else online?
I have one last interjection, and then I'll stay offline for a while. Negative prayer made me think of a funny little Irish prayer, and I just found it. It says, "May those who love us love us. Those who don't love us, may God turn their hearts. If He can't turn their hearts, may He turn their ankles so that we know them from their limp."
That's pretty good.
Touche. I was thinking, Elizabeth, as you spoke of a client I saw this morning who was a senior citizen, and he's been attending a geriatric psychiatry support group because he developed depression after his wife died, and he's been critiquing and telling them how they're lacking something in their program. And so they've asked him to speak to some kind of conference next week. And he plans to tell them what's missing is they're not attending to the people's spiritual needs. And I thought, I thought this is fantastic. I gave him, I said, look, they're ignoring evidence. They're ignoring that spirituality is an essential component to care, and whether he'll use any of that or not, it doesn't matter. But he is going to tell them that this program is flawed but he enjoys the program. But he said it just doesn't go deep enough. They're just scratching the surface. So
it's kind of where our reading took us this week, isn't it? That little bit extra that we're privileged to be a part of, the spirit, not just self, but
yeah. And in our Western society, we are so materialistic and so individualistic that we really don't, and we're not tapping into the energy, like you said, Elizabeth, the collective energy that demanded 3 encores was resonating in that auditorium. And that needs to be named. That is the collective spirit. And it is so valuable and so necessary for us to experience.
But it's almost like everyone is afraid to speak about spiritual things or about God. I find even with the kids, the family, like they're almost embarrassed, that you bring up anything. They don't want to hear it. I don't know what all that's about. They really don't. It's just I don't know if it's the ages they are or what they're going through, they just don't want to hear it.
Anybody have any thoughts on what answers for Irene? She's got these wonderful questions.
I've got an answer.
Don's got an answer.
I got an answer. It's not me. It's Paul Tillich. I go back. I've said it one time before, right? He said, "I hope for the day when everyone can speak of God without embarrassment."
Yeah. That would be wonderful.
That's Paul Tillich. Yeah. Keep it there.
Yeah, he was one very inspired man.
Hi, it's Elizabeth here. I know exactly what you mean about the kids. I mean, I think it's very clear that kids do not do what you say, they do what you do. And I think it's, if you, they will all go through a phase where like, God, who needs that? But if they see you doing whatever you do that's spiritual, and I think it makes an impact. I've sort of seen that with my kids. That the one that I never thought would ever be a spiritual seeker is probably my most deeply spiritual child. And unfortunately, she had some run-ins with some rather fundamentalist and angry churches up in her neck of the woods in Maine, which makes me sad, who are telling her kids all about brimstone and hell and, God knows what, scaring the living daylights out of them. But, she's a seeker, and I think she will continue to seek. And I never would have thought that of her. And so, I don't know, I think it's really important that walking the walk thing. Even if they don't listen to the talk, they sure do see the walk. We know that with cigarettes, we know that with alcohol, and we certainly, I think it's the same with talking about God.
I think it's very easy too to forget that there's a third part, and we talked a little bit about this on the weekend, how, you will look in a mirror every day several times to check your physical appearance. Mm-hmm. And, we feed it and we clothe it, we rest it, we do what our physical being needs. And our mental health, we do our crossword, we watch Jeopardy, we'll clear our minds, go for a walk, whatever we need to do. But how often does the spiritual part, that third part that we're comprised of, how much attention does it get? Mm-hmm. And it may get more attention from me because I'm in the field. Yeah, right. But for those who are in a secular world and are very busy, we don't feed that spirit part of us. And I think our young people, but not just our young people, I think it's right across the board that we just don't think about that third part in the same way. And so it's not really a matter of importance. If you need it, it's there. It's kind of like that crisis prayer, but it could be so much better if you had a healthy concept of your spirit. But we don't. And in this Western world, we're just...
Well, I think an effort's being made. Certainly the great effort that I am aware of to encourage contemplative prayer and encouraging the encouragement of meditation, of mindfulness. The number of people that I refer to mindfulness meditation regularly, and also yoga, practices of yoga. I think yoga centers are filling a major need for people. And I have one client who's, I don't know if it's Taekwondo or it's a martial arts that has, if you knew his story of death and grief in his family, how that has maintained him. He has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder because of all of the loss in his life. And over a long period of time, it was chronic. And so how he's been able to keep his sanity, and I think that discipline has contributed. Now he is also a devout Roman Catholic, but that practice has certainly been his contemplative prayer. Mm-hmm. And I really, that's why I like the video, was that it just broadened, it just encompassed. I can remember the first time I was at a conference and I was introduced to Buddhist walking prayer. And I'd never heard of walking prayer, but I'd been practicing walking prayer. And it was like it gave an endorsement. It gave me an endorsement. Wow. When I'd walk my dog, it was one of my prayer times. And that was my walking. And I learned, I realized, I grew out of praying on my knees and I grew into walking prayer purely intuitively. I didn't know that the Buddhists had practiced this for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. And so it gave me, it was like finding a piece of gold, or it was finding something, it's precious gem.
But much the same with us. I feel God's spirit walking around that pond just as much as I do in that chapel. But now if I were somewhere else, maybe I wouldn't feel the same spirit. But I guess it all depends on your personal preferences.
Does it depend on our personal preferences?
I would think so. Because if I don't feel at ease, how can I bring God into the situation? Or
do you bring God into the situation?
Well, you open yourself up to feel His presence.
I can remember when I was at the Waterford, people would say, we got to bring God into the Waterford Hospital. I said, God's already here. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But sometimes you gotta have the right ears to listen.
Or eyes, or
heart, or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's good to try different things, and sometimes it's good not to fall into a rut and then try something else. That's always an interesting thing too. I don't think there's one hard and fast rule that we all have to pray this way, we all have to pray this way, or everybody should just pray the way they want. It's probably good to try things that we think will never particularly work for us, I would imagine. But it's also good to pay attention. We think about learning styles. There's been so much about that, learning styles for different people. Are you kinesthetic learner? Are you visual? Are you auditory? Are you a mix? Are you whatever? It's probably similar with prayer. And probably, you said you grew into the walking prayer. Probably, if you start with one form, then you might find, once you've really gotten comfortable with that one form, then you might be curious to reach out to try something different and see what that adds. Because different ways of praying probably bring out different dimensions of yourself and of your communication and of your connection to God, I would think. I know that when I pray with art, it's very different than when I do walking prayer, or when I do when I just do daily prayer of the Book of Common Prayer, morning prayer or evening prayer. It just feels very different. They're all good. So maybe for some, the more the merrier, and for some, nope, just stick to one.
I think, Elizabeth, that reminds me of the early part of this course and the study of W. Paul Jones, the theological worlds. That certainly speaks to what you've just said.
Yeah, no, that's true. It does. I actually have a wonderful little booklet that says How We Pray, and it's about 50 different ways from 50 different cultures and spiritualities and religions about different methods of prayer. It's really interesting to read. Like some of them, like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. Using the sand drawings of the Tibetan Buddhists are incredible. Or the sand paintings of the Southwest Native Americans, incredible. I don't know if I could have the patience to do that, but I know there's such a variety of ways and I think what it shows is that humans across the centuries, as you said, and even now in secular ways with yoga and this and that, we are looking for a way to connect. So why not learn from each other about what different peoples have done?
When every second Saturday, I attend a poetry writing reading group in Carbonear at the library, and a person, one of our people chooses a word, and then we write a poem that's either in the word is in the title or is in the poem somewhere, or the meaning of the word is in the poem. And it is just such an example of corporate prayer, the resonance that goes through the room as we each read our poems, and the threads of meaning, the threads of inspiration. It's a very powerful community experience. And I just got off the phone earlier this evening with a friend of mine who's a United Church minister in Corner Brook, and he did a funeral recently where this man was a part of a poetry group, and he facilitated the poetry group to use their poetry in the funeral. And he said it was a very powerful experience. And so in a way, I guess it was collectively sacred text. It's drawing on that third dimension, Janice, like you were saying. The Holy Spirit, I think, is another way of looking at the third dimension. So, Harold, you up to it?
I guess if I'm not ready now, Peter, I won't be.
Speak to us of love, a philosophy of pastoral care and counseling.
How do I love thee? Let me count the ways.
Okay, we got to let you have the floor. Charity, what do I... Audience view? No. Okay, it's easier for you to do it. I'll never learn how to do this.
You don't need to if Charlie's around.
Yeah, but Charlie doesn't...
Teach a man to fish. And
yes, exactly.
you'll be teaching for many years to come.
When you're based on participation,
You know what side your brain's spotted out.
Oh, yeah. There you are, Harold. You're now our presenter.
How's that?
How's what?
We're getting there.
Apparently it's not good.
Something changed, and then it changed back.
Well, let's see if we can do this.
Harold's dog got bored and left.
Yeah.
His dog was laying on just with his arm over the couch, and it's like, I'm done. Enough theology for me.
Somebody went to the kitchen.
Yeah.
So Charlie, I don't know what I'm doing wrong here.
Have you got the button clicked for the share screen?
Yeah. Yeah.
There you are. We got it.
All right.
So you've got my split screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, just click on, or you can do it like that.
Maximize. Maximize and...
Okay. How's that?
Hang on.
Yeah, there you go. That's it. Can we enlarge that, or does he have to enlarge that?
No, you can do that.
That's good.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully you were all able to read through the paper that I picked. I found it to be a very nice, not necessarily a generic paper, but it had a really good overall view of pastoral care and love and compassion. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Sometimes we can find the simplest messages right in front of us. So with this first slide, with the exception of the title that I've placed in the bottom corner, this Anglican billboard that was apparently posted on the side of the highway says it all. Love God, love your neighbor, change the world. the Episcopal Church welcomes you. I went back a little farther than just the writing. I wanted to emphasize God's love and neighborly love and brotherly and sisterly love. So I went back to the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures. We were all told how God's love was used in the creation of the earth from the time of Adam, and God showed His love for Adam, even to the point of providing him with clothes and covering during his exile from he and Eve's exile from the garden. It was God's love that protected humanity and all faithful throughout the early history of His chosen people. God's love for His people brought about the first laws for the children of Israel to follow. And the 10 Commandments were given by God through Moses. They were the laws which guided the faithful to the ever-present love of the Almighty. Time and time again throughout history, we hear of God's intervention to protect His children. And these are just some pictures of David and Goliath and Daniel in the lion's den and Solomon's temple. It was our Savior Jesus Christ who finally confirmed that God's love was so great that He would sacrifice His only Son to prove the value of our lives through salvation. And Jesus at that time reduced the 10 Commandments to the 2 great commandments. Thou shalt love thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. And the second was like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. In His Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke without parables, without needs for inference. He explained the Beatitudes, which were the perfect explanation of how we were to treat one another and how we could expect to be treated. It was our guarantee through our actions of our place with the Heavenly Father, and this love was carried on throughout the centuries to present times. So where do we go from here? We can discuss the historic love of God for hours. It's found throughout both the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures. But today's society is in more need for God's love and brotherly and sisterly love than society has ever been before. This article, Love as a Philosophy of Pastoral Care, written by Frederick Streets, discusses the scientific research into emotions, both negative and positive, and their effects on behavior and healing. The article quotes Barbara Fredrickson's commentary on love. She describes the 3 events which are involved in love. The first is sharing positive emotions with another person. The second is having similar or complementary personality to the other person. And the third thing is a desire to invest in the well-being of the other person. Compassion, by definition, is our desire to relieve the pressures and stresses of another person or even an animal. As clergy and pastoral caregivers, we draw upon our connection with the Lord and our experiences in the church to share His love. And we can do this through intently listening to those placed in our counsel. And it enables us to establish what God means to the other person, how this plays a part in their life. It opens the doors to their fears, and hopefully it allows us to address the topics of mortality and the continuation of our existence after our mortal lives. It helps us to identify what and who our counselees believe in and what they believe themselves to be. And finally, it helps us to establish what part God plays in their sense of security and being loved by Him through His actions. Empathy, we are told, is truly possible. The article speaks on several occasions. It's truly possible through our ability to be completely and fully present during our counseling sessions, not just fading in and out of the conversation, but focusing on the needs of the person that we're with. Focusing on them and what they're saying and their family situation and their social interactions. And it helps us to hear the voiceless voice or the unspoken story. And that's where love is fostered and begins to grow. Mark Twain said that kindness is a language which the deaf can hear and the blind can see. Kindness, friendship, and love are all interwoven, interconnected, and they're languages that span all pain and heal all wounds. As clergy, we can share the love of the Almighty through the lessons that we're taught in our theological reflections of our calling. Paul Tillich is quoted as saying that through love, pastoral counselors can listen and engage through our theological teachings. The love of God is brought into the relationship through our experiences in Christ, and in mutual sharing. Through mutual sharing, we can introduce His love, changing feelings through conversations, attitudes through discussions, and eventually behaviors, creating a new emotionally based person and relationship. And this is all part of our personal interaction and our relationship development that we would have with our counselees. Counseling the traumatized can be one of the hardest tasks that we take on. Many who've experienced trauma have, regardless of what kind of trauma it is, they have difficulty recounting it and talking about the origins of their problems. One of the first things that first responders are taught, and I know this from experience, being on fire rescue for a little over 14 years, is that silence. The silence is deadly. Someone who cries or yells or screams is dealing with their issues in their physical manifestation. They hurt so they cry. They're scared so they yell. They're sad so they cry. But it's the person who sits stone-faced, that's seemingly unaffected, who's in the greatest need of emotional support. Because they've become introverted. They don't want to express their emotions. They're in such shock that their brain just won't let them cope with situations, so they shut down. And they're the hardest ones to provide support for. In this case, we have to convey both our personal love and the love of God. They deal with a large amount of guilt from being left behind, or witnessing atrocities, or violence, or carnage, or destruction. The false face of strength and the added guilt can make it very difficult to deal with, but through love and attention and friendly shoulder and an attentive ear, even the worst situations can be talked through over time. Listening allows us to connect with our counselees. It gives us the opportunity to learn about their fears and their needs, their wants, and their concerns. It connects us through mutual knowledge and mutual love of the Almighty, and it allows us to share His love with those that we're with, those that we're sharing our experiences, our life experiences, and our emotions with. And this is referred to as the listening love by Paul Tillich, and he maintains that it's essential for us to be successful as pastoral caregivers and counselors. Plays an integral part in the construction of our own personalities and our experiences, and allows us to be better providers. As we provide a loving environment for our counselees, our relationship grows into a friendship and is built on support and empathy, compassion and kindness, attentive listening, faith and love. We can not only help people to grow and heal, but we can also grow and become stronger ourselves through shared experiences and new friendships. In summary, if we could practice the two great commandments, practice the love of our brothers and sisters in humanity, our connection with God and His love will grow stronger. And we can reinforce that love in all our interactions with those that we support and care for. And that is the end of my slideshow.
And the beginning of our discussion.
And the beginning of the discussion.
Thank you, Harold. Questions, comments?
It's Taylor here. The part of your presentation talked about being traumatized. This made me think about recently lived with a family who had two kids the same age, both adopted, and from different families. And in their, I guess, early years, have gone through some significant trauma. One of the children kind of internalized the trauma, and so I would kind of relate them to the stone face portion you mentioned. And the other one was very extroverted in expressing her trauma, any emotions, any feelings. And I just remember the mom being worried, not about the one who was expressing all of the hurt and pain, but she was worried about the one who was internalizing all of it. Because even though she looked fine on the outside, her mom was aware, I guess, of what you brought up, Harold, that it's the person that's holding in the trauma that needs the most support, and it's going to be the most difficult to support. I just thought that was interesting to have a real life example of what you were talking about, and I can definitely relate in seeing it firsthand that that is perhaps the person who needs the most support, the person that internalizes it, and you might not even know needs that extra support.
So Harold, do you want to speak to what Taylor is saying?
That's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. It's unfortunately I was in a position, like I say, over 14 plus years that on a number of occasions I would have to sit in on debriefings. And it was quite often, in our case, it was quite often the 6'4", 250-pound RCMP officers that were fresh out of Regina that were the ones that ended up needing the most help. They just, of all the things that you think can prepare you for that type of situation, whether it be a motor vehicle accident or a murder scene or whatever, because in our small rural area we were called to everything. You cannot begin to prepare someone for that type of situation, that mental image that just haunts you. over time. My wife could speak on this much more eloquently than I can. She was a methods and resource teacher for 34 years. So some of the things that she saw in the school system and working with social services, I know that she still can't talk about, but there are situations that still bother her. And obviously the children are worse than the adults because that's how they do deal with it. They bury it. It's out of everything that I've dealt with in my, I'll say, short lifetime, even though I'm 52 years old, there are things that even though I've dealt with, I'll still never forget. And it's hard to, I know for a fact that there are some things that are just, they're hard to talk about.
Harold, one of the things that really struck me about this paper was the fact that it said conversation between two people can affect the quality of their life. A conversation can be crucial because it can be transformative. You know, like it's a story that the people are telling, and it's the listening that's going on with the person that is listening to them and so on, that brings on the healing, and it changes both. It changes the person who is telling the story, but it also changes the person who is listening to it, because it's a conversation really that's going on between two people. And I'm wondering how that kind of storytelling applies to what you said about debriefing from a trauma experience.
I think that they're completely connected. I don't think that, and Charlie could tell you from our ACPO experience last year in St. John, when you sit down with a group of people, or when you sit down one-on-one, and the person that you're with or the people that you're with are confiding their deepest, darkest secrets to you, and you to them, it's a bond that, regardless of what happens in the rest of your life, it's a bond that you'll always have. It's a connection, and when we try to use love as one of the main influences in healing or progressing beyond the point where you are, when you want to use it as your main building block towards healing, then you're going to continue to make those connections. So each connection you make is another brick towards building a new life, if you want to use that analogy. I think they're very similar, Don.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Harold.
I like it in the conclusion, Harold, where it says, the last paragraph, this requires that pastoral counselors increase their awareness and be intentional in our practice of loving others and themselves. That's the intention of pastoral counselors. And even though throughout this course we seem to distinguish between pastoral counselors and pastoral caregivers, I think that we are all the people who practice pastoral ministry are counselors, are caregivers. They're both, and so even though pastoral counselors have more psychological training than pastoral caregivers for the most part, I think that this is core to all of us. that we increase our awareness and be intentional in our practice of loving others and ourselves. This is critical, I think, in the practice of ministry, and like I get people, like some of the people I work with, some of the clients I have are chronic in their mental illness, and how hard it is sometimes. One young man I think of, he's in his mid-30s now, and his sister died by suicide, and he's been at risk of suicide for a long time, as is his father as well. Like that's like a veil over that family, and how to coach that man when he starts to get well, a little bit well, is nothing short of love. He has to feel that love. He has to feel that he's never rejected. And when I worked at the Waterford Hospital, I used to think that when people were in their acute phase of their schizophrenia and actively paranoid schizophrenic, and their paranoia in full blown paranoia, and all I could think of was, I will be there. And I hope that they can always say, you were there when I was at my lowest. And so, like, that kind of love, I feel, has to permeate through our practice. This United Church minister, a friend of mine that I was speaking to earlier, was saying how he knows clergy who refuse to go to the hospitals. And I think, like, how can I practice if I'm responsible pastorally for someone? How can I refuse to go to a hospital? How can I refuse to get people information on MAID? Like, it's not for me to decide what's right for someone. It's for me to facilitate a person responding to love and responding to the Spirit of God. So I really, maybe I'm taking what this article a bit further, but it just is. I think it really is. It's an excellent. Some of the points that are made here are very, very good.
I think that Elizabeth here, what you just said, I was just looking at the section Postmodern Pastoral Care, Operationalizing Love, and he at the end of the first paragraph says, in this way, love's aim is, as Tillich suggests, descends to misery and ugliness and guilt in order to elevate. That's exactly what you just said. And I think if we're not able to go there, and if we're not able to deal with that in ourselves, which is where I think the debriefing comes in, I think that's where we as pastoral caregivers, who obviously should go to the hospital, or should go to the depths of ugliness and misery, or we're, what are we doing if we're not doing that? Somehow we need to, come back to what Harold said about the debriefing. I've found, that you get put in a role and everybody sees you as a sort of strong leader of a group, and that's the role that I got put into. And good Lord, nothing could have been further from the truth, but it was really hard for me to talk about how I was affected by the death of a very young child, say, or a young mother dying of cancer, because I was kind of consoling all the other caregivers on the team. So that kind of that burned me out eventually. It really did. So I think that's really important, that sort of these roles that we watch carefully, what roles we willingly take on. It's nice to be considered the pillar of strength, but it doesn't, in the long run, it's probably not all that healthy.
I think one of the biggest things that we have to remember, or we have to realize, is the amount of love that we have in us. It's not a limited commodity. My grandmother always used to tell us that if she'd had 20 grandchildren, she would have just had more love to go around. It wasn't that she had so much for each one of us. She had enough for all of us. And I would equate it, Peter, to the story I told you earlier in the course about one of my theology professors at AST using the analogy of the sponge and the Holy Spirit. And the greater your connection with God, the more your sponge filled with the Holy Spirit, until it got to the point where the sponge was saturated and the Holy Spirit spilled out through you onto other people, but the Holy Spirit kept coming up and refilling the sponge so that it was always full and it was always overflowing. And I think that as soon as we can convince ourselves that love is the same way, I think it's much easier for us to share that with people and for us to communicate in a way that people realize that we're being genuine in our empathy and our sympathy and our compassion and our faith and our love and the hope for their situation and their healing. I think everything is so interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. It's Elizabeth again. I've just gotten back into sort of clinical care, and I sat with a relatively young man, and I was the doctor. I was supposed to be there to deal with his pain, but we really talked about, he just sort of emptied his heart to me, and I felt myself empty myself, but I felt this light just going through me and to him, and I didn't do anything. I didn't adjust his pain meds. I didn't do anything except listen and reaffirm, his belief in his own worth, and that it wasn't his fault that he was sick, because apparently people have been telling him, well, what did you do to deserve, what did you do that was bad that got you this cancer? I was like, oh my gosh. But, at the end of the session, he felt so much better, and his pain was so much better. I did a little bit of healing touch. I could really feel that light sort of going through, and I don't think I could have done that 10 years ago the way I can do it now. And I think even this class has helped me immensely in being able to do that again for people. So I think there is this vast amount of light and energy out there, and love, call it what you will, that if we are open and we are open to love and we love back, and it's hard to explain, but I think we've all felt it at one time or another.
This course is called Theology and Pastoral Care. So what is the impact that this love has on our theology? And does our theology then enhance our practice of pastoral care and counseling?
I think for the most part, theology and our views on theology have everything to do with our pastoral care. If we're firm in our belief that at the end of our mortal life there's a place for us, then those feelings and those hopes are going to be passed on. They're going to be hopefully accepted, but they may just be one of those points of change for the new emotional person that we're helping heal. If there are things or situations, whether they're political or church related, any of our conversations, if we're having genuine conversation in counseling or prayer, any of our thoughts in an open-minded conversation are going to be accepted, just as we're going to accept them from other people. And I think that our theological perspectives are one of the main cornerstones of that.
I think when I think theology, if I think the love of God, the Bible tells us that God is love, and we see his love through the Old Testament into the New Testament in a different way. His love sometimes came out as discipline or correction or rebuke, but there was consistency. There's nowhere that he tells us he doesn't love us. Even when they felt like they were abandoned, they were still loved. And I think that whole being consistent in our love for others. If you go in on Monday and the counselee feels that they sense love or a loving relationship being built, and then the next time you go, it's completely different. I think there has to be some consistency to that. And I think that's how I see it. God consistent in love, whether it's to correct or rebuke or to provide or to redeem. And really, we show love so that someone might be restored to wholeness.
So thank you, Harold. It seems like that's where we're at. Anyone that hasn't spoken like to put a last word into Harold before we move on to our next piece?
Charlie, do you have the screen back now?
Yeah, I'll take it back now.
Okay.
It's a good article, Harold. Really good. I really enjoyed it.
Gave us lots to
Thank
think
you.
about, Harold.
Yeah.
Lots.
Really good.
That's so true what you were saying about Janice, about love.
I think you got to do that on your
Hasn't.
end, Harold. Just go, where the attendees log is? And we're showing everyone who's online?
Can't hear.
Oh, we can't hear you.
He wasn't
Can you
saying.
hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah, you see the list of people online?
Yeah, and it's showing me as presenter still.
All right, yeah. You see Theology and Pastoral Care Singleton?
Yeah.
Right click on that.
Make presenter. Yes.
All right.
You're good?
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Janice, I was thinking when you were saying that how we, should let people know, I guess, the way that the love that we feel for them. It's really strange because and you probably know that I'm really serious type person, right?
No.
And my little, no, but I am sometimes and I forget. But my little granddaughter is 7. Twice she's after saying to me in the past 2 weeks, "But Nana, why are you so sad?" It just blew me away. Twice. We're up on the playground and I was pushing her back and forth, swinging, and out of the blue. So she must see something in my face that makes her look sad. But that really makes me think when I go down to the Miller Center when I'm visiting patients now, and there's a man down there that I know, and I know he knows my sister and now my sister is the complete opposite of me. I mean, she's really a different makeup altogether. I'm quiet, whereas she's rambunctious in my mind, right? And he knows my sister. So when he got to know me, he said, "I can't believe you're so different." I said, "Oh yeah, we're like chalk and cheese, but that's okay. She got her way, I have my way, right?" And I was walking up the corridor the other day and he was coming out of the room and he says, "Oh my, you look so sad today." And I said, "Oh my golly, people are trying to tell me something." So now I'm really conscious of it. So I try to keep this smile on my face, when I'm going in. I'm more conscious, like it made me aware, and that reminded me when you
But are you
said that.
sad?
No, I don't feel sad. And I've said to him, I said, "No, I'm not. I'm really not sad." I said, "I'm really great today, and I usually am. I mean, I'm not a sad person. Never.
No.
I'm never sad. But I guess they must see something in my face. So now I'm more conscious of it. So I'm trying to, when I'm just walking now, I think, now, how's my face today? Am I looking sad? But isn't it strange that she would pick that up and say,
Yeah.
"But Nana, why are you sad?" But it broke my heart when she said it, because I don't want her to think that I am sad, because I'm not. But I don't know why. So I thought of that when you were saying that. So my golly, but I'm really more
But at
conscious
the
of it.
same time, if you just put on a
Yeah.
face,
Yes, it's
then
not.
you're not.
Yeah, but I'm not sad, so I don't
Okay.
mind that, right? But I just don't want people to think that I'm sad, because I'm not. I'm really a positive
Interesting.
person. Yeah. But twice she said to me, "Nana, why are you sad?" So I have to be more conscious of that, the way I look, because I'm not sad. I mean, it's different if I were sad and I was just trying to be happy. But it's just, I guess, the expression on my face.
Mm-hmm.
And if I put on a happy face.
Well, I know I'm really intense, and my daughter will always say, "Mom, are you mad?" But
Yeah.
it's just when I'm focused, I'm really intense. You should see me play piano. If I'm focused, it's like I look like the meanest person in the world.
Maybe that's what it is with me, because I mean, I'm really conscientious of what I'm doing, type thing, and maybe that's where it's coming from, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, I've just got to be more aware of it. You reminded me. Yeah.
So I suggest we take our 10-minute break now and then resume in a few minutes.
Mhm.
Sound okay?
So you're going to say
Your name wasn't on it.
no, because I kept looking. Even last night when I got Peter's,
Yeah.
I said, "How come we didn't get the reading?"
Yeah, that was something earlier in the week.
Right? Yeah, I kept looking every day.
Yeah.
So
Peter, is there much room in the health science health place up in Berlin? Is there many rooms there?
I don't know. I've never been in there.
I've been there quite a few times, like in the pharmacies and so on, right? But I don't know what kind of space they got there. I'll find out. I'll find out on Friday when I go home.
Or like lots of times, if we can't get space in a clinic, the town hall will give us space for these kinds of things too.
Community councils?
Oh yeah.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
That's it's.
I'll check that out because I know them quite a bit, right? I'll check out both places. Like I say, I mean, it shouldn't stop because someone says no.
Oh, I never.
Never think about that.
That's.
Huh?
No.
That's the feeling I'm getting. So it's got to go ahead as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I'll be working. Anyway, if you Charlie do something for me now. I can feel an argument coming on. When I get home. I'm sorry. But that's true. Like, both people sharing their left-handed. And, whereas, and because if you're left-handed, you use the strong use the right side of the
And then I would imagine, the person playing, some people study it. In the next page, we can preach and actually I thought through that. What I got from that is that he was saying that they were, not talking consistent. The Norway was always so strict. They're all stories. They were actually no longer, they were not extended, but actually only now
slightly different, but it's a certain spirit that we have to follow. You know, it was like, you know, I hate to use this now with philosophically, being a politician, and I know that gods or politicians, but, you know, politicians, if they feel that somebody's, particularly good with problems or whatever, they know that they gotta, you know, I'm not saying do legal or do more things, but, you know, you have to be able to, you know what to do and what to say. You know, if no, then I see. That's right, jump, yeah. And that's what I think those people. Because today I read some stories about Paul and so on. It's pretty common that a lot of people sensation. If I said I had a vision of God, so but that's very common. Somebody can ask so see, their college is that particularly bonds. They're not being stopped. What the debate is that, you know, it's still sort of like a script. I think that's the concept of process and really that water, what that means. That's how it goes. Said that. It's amazing what people can come up with. Yeah, it's good.
It's okay, Peter.
Sorry for the delay.
You'll have to make us stay behind.
You could have started without us.
I can talk to myself anytime.
Dan was performing for us. Should have brought it in here, then they could have heard.
Well, that's probably more than I need to know.
What does that say there at the bottom? I have to go.
I have to sign off now in case you're wondering why I'm being so quiet. Take care, everyone. And that's from Taylor.
Right.
Oh, all that I left the recording on all that time. Oh, I hope they can fast forward. So we're waiting for Don and Charlie to come back. Hopefully they won't be too much longer. I'm using Henry Nouwen's book, Creative Ministry, to speak to this part of the session on teaching. That's the theme for today, and I think that it complements the article that Harold introduced to us, and the some of what Harold was saying as well, in that the teaching of pastoral care and counseling is certainly done through love, and how important that is.
What is the name of the book?
Creative Ministry. Henry Nouwen. And he talks about from a violent to a redemptive way of learning, and so that's kind of what I want to get across, because violent learning has never gotten us anywhere, and those of you who are teachers might identify with this, and how futile learning has been at times in our society because it's been so violent. So I'll help you to kind of capture some of that. A quote from this book: there was a man on a horse galloping swiftly along the road. An old farmer standing in the fields, seeing him pass by, called out, "Hey, rider, where are you going?" The rider turned around and shouted back, "Don't ask me, just ask my horse." That the idea that that teaching is not always what we do, but there's the collective power of opportunities for learning that is the teacher, and it's not necessarily dependent on one person, but rather the collective. And I think that we've been talking about that tonight as well. The value is, as we were saying in the first part, and Elizabeth was describing the concerts she attended, and how much that was. It sounded like such a beautiful, prayerful learning experience that that was obviously collective. Nouwen's question: what do those who call themselves teachers or students really claim to be when they look at themselves in the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ? what do those who call themselves teachers or students really claim to be when they look at themselves in the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ? How does reading or reflection on the gospel or the ministry of Jesus Christ, how does that make us feel?
I don't think for us to carry on his teachings necessarily makes us teachers as much as it does make us followers with a message. Does that make sense?
Yes. And how has that been claimed or fostered in the article that we've read today, or in the video about prayer? What's the common theme or theology that's being conveyed through all of this? Or maybe there's more than one or two of that.
Well, it seems to me that one of the common threads is the sharing of life experience, and I mean, obviously, it's like a parent telling their child to do that because, and the child taking your word for it or giving you credit to know what you're talking about. I think that's. We have to take the teachings of Christ and add to those our own life experiences, our own life lessons, and go from there and use those for the foundation of our spreading the word. If I want to avoid teaching.
Harold, it was difficult to get the nuance of what you were saying because you'd break up every so many words. So it's hard to respond. I'm not sure that I heard what you said.
Can you hear me now, or am I breaking up?
That was okay. Yeah.
Okay. All I was trying to say, Peter, is I think that what we have to do in order to go forward, and not necessarily teaching, but sharing the word, is to combine the teachings of Christ with the theology that we're taught throughout our lives, with our own life experiences and life lessons. And it seems as if life experience and personal experience seems to be the common thread throughout the article that I read and covered tonight, and what I understand from Henry Nouwen's work.
Thank you.
I think I like the idea of servanthood that comes out in John 13, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet, and the idea that a servant is not greater than his master, although that sounds pretty contradictory to what I'm about to say. A servant's not great. How does that go? A servant's not greater than his master? Or a servant is greater than his master? Or not, and not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. And Jesus humbled himself and became nothing. And
countercultural. It's contrary to what culture.
Yeah, the
claims.
last shall be first. Yes. All of those ideas, and just how you learn when you're the least among them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what the writer was in that short clip. Don't ask me, just ask my horse.
Yeah.
Like how do we acknowledge our vulnerability and our what's the word? Fragility or just
Humanness.
insignificance in some ways when we compare ourselves to the age of the rocks, for instance, and the power of the universe. How,
Like the greatest teacher in this room tonight may very well be your granddaughter.
She made me stop and think
Right.
of the image I was portraying.
And we have this idea of a professor but yet, you know, just the smallest child who is very innocent may be the greatest teacher in the room.
that's right. Yeah. Any other comments on any of this?
As a
I
teacher.
think this is Elizabeth. I was thinking the thing that sort of goes through for me as a thread, and it ties in with love, is this idea of radical acceptance. You know, all the stories of Jesus show that the way he loved people at first was just to accept where they were, where they were at. He didn't accept that they stay there necessarily, but he accepted them exactly as in the place that they were to be found, and then he challenged them, you know, to go to a place where they could be, and to a place where they could be more themselves than they were now. So, you know, one of the things that I've found in my work is, doesn't matter what room I walk into, you know, whether I'm walking into a room of somebody who I know on the outside I'd probably be fighting tooth and nail politically, you know, he's sitting there with a, you know, Trump t-shirt on or something, doesn't matter, you know, I'm going to accept that person right there with their suffering and their story for who they are, or that very angry person, or whatever. It's so radical acceptance is one thing that runs through there for me.
It's interesting, Elizabeth. I brought this book along. I wasn't sure why I was bringing it. It's called Radical Acceptance, Embracing Your Life with the Heart of a Buddha, by Tara Brach. And I found that a very moving book, because she really stresses the significance of radical acceptance and radical acceptance of ourselves. How important that is.
Yeah, that's definitely.
Go on.
I said that radical acceptance of self. I think that's definitely part of it. Because if you're sitting there unhappy with yourself and always comparing yourself to and this is a little bit of what he talks about, the violent way of learning. If you're always comparing yourself, I'm not as good as that person. It's going to be hard for you to radically accept anybody else. You know, if you're still in that state of keeping up intellectually or, you know, financially or whatever with the Joneses.
In this first chapter, the prologue, or the prologue, it says, something is wrong with me. And it says, with my college friend, it was different. I trusted her enough to be completely open. Over the next 2 days of hiking on high mountain ridges, sometimes talking with her, sometimes sitting in silence, I began to realize that beneath all my mood swings, depression, loneliness, and addictive behavior lurked that feeling of deep personal deficiency. I was getting my first clear glimpse into a core of suffering that I would revisit again and again in my life. While I felt exposed and raw, I intuitively knew that by facing this pain, I was entering a path of healing. And so, like, how do we become teachers from our vulnerability? How do we become teachers from acknowledging our need for Jesus Christ? That vulnerability, that profound acceptance of what may seem to be so different than we are. He lays out two models, the violent one and the redemptive model. So he describes the violent process, the idea of constant confronted with complicated problems, search for new skills, methods, and techniques to get these problems under control. So the whole idea of getting control, and it implies a kind of one-upmanship. If I have more knowledge than you, then I'm more. And knowledge is control. The more knowledge we have, the more we feel confident and in control. The characteristics of this are competitive, unilateral, and alienating. The competitive is competing with self. You're trying to outdo yourself, and grades are important, and discussion is important. So that's the challenging, the competitive that permeates so much of what we call teaching and learning. And then there's the unilateral. Teachers know, students don't. A person is competent, another person is incompetent. There's the strong, and then there's the weak. And we grade people according to some arbitrary grading system. So it's the whole idea of the unilateral. It's unilateral in its control. And then there's the alienating. School is not real. School is not real world, and yet it's the dry run for life. And there's lack of engagement. It's very much individualism. And in this book, page 10, I'll read what Nouwen says. And this is an introduction to the redemptive process. The whole process is alienating because neither students nor teachers have been able to express their own individuality or use their regular relationships with each other as a primary source of learning. They have been pulled away from their own experiences. They are staring into the horizon, expecting something to appear there, while at the same time they have become blind to what is happening right in front of them. When many people spend about 20 years in school, it can be asked how valuable their lives have been if they should die at the end of those 20 years of life. Do those 20 years serve only as a preparation for another 20 years, which in their turn have to make possible a final 20 years of retirement? But when a man does not really live here and now, why should he look forward to living somewhere else later? This is the core of alienation, a reality that is all too visible in the life of many students and teachers. We have now described the violent process of teaching as one that is competitive, unilateral, and alienating. While it might never be found in its total naked destructiveness, it should nonetheless be clear that elements of it can be detected in many of our contemporary educational methods. Now we are ready to look at an alternative model, which I have called redemptive. I would hope that the foregoing elaboration has created the desire to hear more about it. So to hear more about the redemptive process. And the reason that this is a part of this course as one of our classes is that pastoral caregivers, pastoral counselors have to see themselves as teachers. And I've used a quote, I'm sure I've used it here, where Henry Nouwen has said that his wounds are his greatest gift. And so like that, like how much do we bring our woundedness? How much do I bring my woundedness to share with you people as a very, very significant piece of my learning? of my, or not of my learning and my knowledge or my life experience that I can share with you people. And how do we capture that? How do we bring that to this, or certainly in the healthcare system where I work, everything has to be evidence-based. There's no room for the movement of the Spirit, because everything has to be documented and verified in some way. So Henry Nouwen is really encouraging us. How do we as pastors embrace our life situation and the challenges and the questions and the doubts as some of the most valuable aspects of life that I can teach to others? So in some ways, how do you learn vulnerability, authenticity? Because that is the model of Jesus Christ, as I know, that is that's clear and simple. So he goes on to say, if it is true that in many instances we have become the passive victims of an educational process whose impact on us we can hardly appreciate, it is imperative that we ask what exactly it is that has happened to us. As my first general impression, I suspect that we too often have lost contact with the source of our own existence and have become strangers in our own house. We tend to run around trying to solve the problems of our world while anxiously avoiding confrontation with that reality wherein our problems find their deepest roots, our own selves. We tend to run around trying to solve the problems of our world while anxiously avoiding confrontation with that reality wherein our problems find their deepest roots, that is, our own selves. In many ways, we are like the busy man who, and please excuse the pronouns here, in many ways, we are like the busy man / woman who walks up to a precious flower and says, "What, for God's sake, are you doing here? Can't you get busy some way?" And then finds him or herself unable to understand the flower's response. "I am sorry, sir, madam, but I am just here to be beautiful." So the flower says, "I am sorry, sir, madam, but I am just here to be beautiful." How can we also come to this wisdom of the flower that being is more important than doing? How can we come to a creative contact with the grounding of our own life only through a teacher who can lead us to the source of our existence by showing us who we are and thereby what we are to do? Showing us who we are and thereby what we are to do. So teachers and students need mutual acceptance. And the characteristics of the redemptive process that Nouwen puts forward are evocative, bilateral, and actualizing. And so we'll give you a snapshot of that. So evocative is to evoke in each other the respective potential. So is this course evoking in you your potential? Is it stirring in you the potential that you have to be and are and to be, and not just to do, but to be a pastoral minister? Does it build each other? Are we building each other through this experience? Are we sharing roles? Do we take turns being the teacher in this course? Do we draw from each other's experiences and insights? And are we making discoveries together, not just individually? I want to share with you this experience I had on Saturday with this poetry group, because I was so moved by one of the writers, one of the poets, and her name is Florence Button, and she's like a local historian in Carbonear, and she wrote a poem that depicted a mother whose son at age 14 lied about his age and went off to the First World War. And so this poem was written about the mother's reflection on the night before the Battle of Beaumont Hamel, and how the mother had a premonition that something was going to happen to her son. And that evening she was so moved that she moved to her knees and spent the whole night on her knees in active prayer for her son. And then the poem ends with him coming home, and how this connection there was between the mother and the son, and through the horror of that Beaumont Hamel experience, and we all know that so few returned, and so that was a profound learning. It was an experience for me that I really appreciated, because it connected with my own experience of having my son and daughter-in-law in Afghanistan for 7 months in 2009, and remembering that when my son came home, and even to this day, when I picture us at the cenotaph here in St. John's on Remembrance Day 2010, and he would introduce me to colleagues, and because he had been an active member of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment before he went into regular force, so he had lots of colleagues here in St. John's, lots of members of the forces with him, and I was choking back my emotions. It was just so intense, and how I identified with that mother and what she was doing in her acts and being of prayer. She prayed with the whole of her being. And it didn't, in one way, it didn't matter the outcome. What mattered was the act of the prayer and her being in prayer for that time. And so is our experience evocative? And now one goes on with the bilateral instead of unilateral. So the teacher learns from the student, and the student learns from the teacher, and maybe by some miraculous, students learn from students, and maybe even teachers learn from teachers. Who would ever have thought that there's an open-ended, there's no all-encompassing learning or all-encompassing literature or whatever the learning is. It's open-ended. There's always more to go beyond the objectives. We state objectives. Are we meeting the objectives that I laid out in the syllabus? Or is there even more than these objectives Are we open to the experience? And I go back to what Elizabeth said, and that experience of that concert. I'm really glad you went to that concert, Elizabeth, because it was obviously a very, very important learning and prayer time for you. To go beyond the objectives and to look for new outcomes.
One of the most exciting years of my teaching career was teaching in a one-room school.
Yeah.
And it was K to 8. And I had 26 students. And my wife had the same in another community just opposite, just over from us, right? But like you say, the way the students learn from one another,
yeah,
it wasn't me, because when I went there, those kids were already trained in helping one another.
Exactly.
You know, and so like I came in as a teacher, but I was more of a facilitator for the whole year, because the older ones were teaching, the young ones and so on, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful experience, right?
And that's the times until I became what we call a clinical pastoral education teaching supervisor. I don't know that I really had a grasp of my pastoral ministry. But when I had to flush it through and interpret it with people, then it was integrated into me. And that, I think it's, and the group work, and whenever I do group work, wow, if you work with mental health clients, they are the best teachers for cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, they know it inside out. So it's what we tap into rather than what we convey. So actualizing, to build a better world, the signs must become visible in daily life. The signs must become visible in daily life. We cannot speak about peace and freedom without experience of the same. If we don't have the experience of peace and freedom, reconciliation, I tell all my clients, I say the objective, as I understand it, the objective of grief counseling is reconciliation, reconciling with oneself and reconciling with our deceased loved one. And then that means working towards a sense of peace with that loved one. And for some people, it's completely foreign. And teaching cannot be training camp for mission in violent society. Teaching cannot be a training camp for mission in a violent society. So, any comments on those three? Where is it? The three characteristics of the redemptive process? Bernard Lonergan was a famous Roman Catholic theologian, and he was certainly respected and honored, and I think he died in 1984, in fact. But Nouwen has quoted him, and he was talking about resistance against learning. And Nouwen says, learning is meant to lead to a redemptive insight into the condition of man and woman in their world, in this world. But do we always desire insight? So Bernard Lonergan writes, just as insight can be desired, so too it can be unwanted. Beside the love of light, there can be a love of darkness. If prepossessions and prejudices notoriously vivitate theoretical investigations, much more easily can elementary passions bias understanding in practical and personal matters. To exclude an insight is also to exclude the further questions that would arise from it and the complementary insights that would carry it towards a rounded and balanced viewpoint. So when we cut off discussion or suppress what might sound like a ridiculous idea, we are stifling further questions. And I hope that you would call me if I ever am doing that in this class. To exclude an insight is also to exclude the further questions that would arise from it and the complementary insights that would carry it towards a rounded and balanced viewpoint. If any of you have heard of, there's a bank of knowledge that compares dialogue to discussion or dialogue to debate. Debate implies winners and losers. Dialogue implies winners and winners, because dialogue requires listening as well as speaking, whereas debate, you're constantly making your own point. So there's always that competition for one to be a winner and one to be a loser. And that stifles teaching and learning. To lack that fuller view results in behavior that generates misunderstanding both in ourselves and in others. To suffer such incomprehension favors a withdrawal from the outer drama of human living into the inner drama of fantasy. To suffer such incomprehension favors a withdrawal from the outer drama of human living into the inner drama of fantasy. This is heavy stuff. And so I think that the other references here, Lonergan uses a term, scotoma, and that implies blind spots. And so the whole idea that blind spots can be our teachers. You know, the justice, when justice seems so abstract, hunger seems so abstract that it becomes a blind spot. And can that be an invitation into learning? What keeps us blind to the obvious? Wrong suppositions, giving, receiving, false pressure, re-academic accomplishments, horror of self-encounter. So Nouwen's conclusion, he says, the core idea of this chapter has been that ultimately we can only come from a violent form of teaching to a redemptive form of teaching through a conversation that pervades our total personality and breaks the power of our resistance against learning. In my sense, what he's talking about here is that embracing the vulnerability, consistent with what Leonard Cohen or Rumi says when they say, keep your gaze on the crack, because that's where the light gets in. So in the midst of our darkness, keep our gaze on the crack, because that's where the light gets in. So the fracture in our heart, the fracture in our soul, that's where the light gets in. That's what I hear him saying here. I made reference to the poem I wrote for this past poet session that I was at, and I forgot that I had it here, but I do have it, and so I'm going to read it to you.
Are you going to beat him out?
Not going to sing it, are you, Peter?
I could chant it, I suppose. I call it transition, transforming the pillar to person, the corpse to new life. Transition, transforming the pillar to person, the corpse to new life. Livened leaves blow to and fro, dancing merrily on the ground. No need to pitch and stay like busy bees from pillar to post. Or is it from garden to flower bed, or sidewalk to gutter? Majestic in color, texture and gentle, ruffled sound. Majestic in color, texture, and gentle, ruffled sound. October to November, transitioning season, preparing to rest. Dying ever so softly, inconspicuously, yet picture perfect. Is it to grave or is it to bed? Dying to self or the self dying? Each leaf falls gracefully, softly, or hastened by the wind. The body, the mind may die gracefully or with ravaging terror. We watch and wait and wonder, the same nature transitioning, the same breath that blows the leaves wanes from the body, and there's a last breath, the leaf's last flutter and touchdown. But the leaf pitches only to be blown again and again. Might it be possible, perchance, the dead shudder and shake from the grave? The rising of the weary one to dance and smile and laugh? To overcome that which we called the end, the final crescendo, finished. Oh, to transcend the horror, the destruction, the annihilation, only to discover, to realize the potential, the promise in the corpse. Oh, to overcome the mindset of, take this cup from me, it is finished. Rising with fervor to release the shackles that bind and suppress. Dance, dance wherever and everywhere. Open wide, wider still, the collective, mystical body, mind, and spirit. Ever changing, evolving. Shine, shine, shine with grace and mercy. Let there be light and life. Send forth love. I hope there's a connection from all of this. Any comments, questions before we move to the
Beautiful imagery.
Yeah.
Very beautiful imagery. Yeah.
I find the fall is my favorite. I love the beauty of the fall, but it's also some of the saddest time of it.
Yeah.
For me, it's very sad. My dad died 21 years ago yesterday. And my mom died in September of 5 years ago. And their deaths at times overshadow the way I feel and the energy that I have this time of year. And so when I'm able to tap into the energy that I feel when I write that poem, when I wrote that poem, I find that it's connecting with God in ways that transcend my mind, which is so helpful because my mind is often so destructive, and so the energy that you felt, I appreciate. That's to me is, and so like the levels of learning, levels of teaching.
I like that line that you said there, just struck me for some reason, right? It was the line, the promise in the corpse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Resurrection. You know?
That's
What
right.
I thought of too, resurrection. I thought, oh my God, maybe you did get together.
Yeah.
And the potential of the grave. And the line again when I read it this now, but the leaf pitches only to be blown again and again.
That was a nice image.
Yeah.
Like that is powerful. It's, Anyway, that gives you a little bit of background of where it comes from for me. Anybody online? Anyone want to comment on this piece of the reflection on teaching from Henry Nouwen and Bernard Lonergan and myself? Anything on teaching as pastoral caregivers and counselors, and how we are teachers and how we have to use ourselves in our practice? In clinical pastoral education, we use a term, the living human document. The living human document, and it comes from Anton Boyson was the founder of clinical pastoral education at Massachusetts State Hospital back in the 1920s, and he helped people to realize that we learn from ourselves, from the human. We are the living human document. And so we are the teachers. Our life experience is our teacher, and we teach others through our life experience.
I guess, Peter, if you want, I can weigh in one last time before we move on. I've often thought that we're a bit like a teacup that's fallen off the counter. It can be glued back together again. It may not look the same, it may not see the same, but it still holds a cup of tea.
Oh, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it leaks.
And sometimes it leaks. Yeah. But I think it's still a teacup, and maybe not as pretty as it was before. But I don't know if you can still hear me or not. You seem to be breaking up a little bit. But it just seems as if the older we get and the more things we go through, it seems as if, to me anyway, that it's easier to counsel people or to share at least in their heartache. My sister and I watched our dad fade away after a malignant brain tumor. We were with our mom when she passed away. We were with our grandmother when she passed away. So to be able to go in and use those experiences to share someone's grief, knowing their grief, I think is probably one of our greatest assets.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love when you spoke about the teacup. I love the story of the rose window in a cathedral in London during the Blitz that was shattered, and how the people gathered up all the pieces and glued the backing together, and it became more beautiful than it had ever been before. That's a wonderful metaphor that I find. So that kind of speaks to the teacup as well. Anyone else? So the chapter of the text this week has been acceptance of self and spirit. Comments?
The sound of silence.
What did people find helpful in this chapter?
I found the author provided clear background on the difference between spirit and self. You know, sometimes, according to the author, people get the two mixed up, and one supersedes the other. So I felt that good.
Did anybody, has anybody ever come across Dr. John Cobb before this? Anybody know anything about Dr. John Cobb? He's an American, I think from Texas. He's a theologian. He's a process theologian. Anybody familiar with process theology?
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea that life is a process and is evolving. And so he wrote, the self is spirit. Only when the self as the organizing center transcends the emotions and other aspects of the psychic life. Only as the self takes responsibility for one's whole life and orients it in its entirety to the word, with a capital W, do self and spirit coalesce. Like that kind of language dances, as far as I'm concerned. It's really allowing the spirit. So I think, like you said, Charlie, the significance of self and spirit and being aware of the spirit. And I can remember when I was in active parish ministry and preaching every Sunday, I would so look forward to my own sermons. I always worked in multi-point parishes, and consequently, I'd preach most Sundays 3 times, sometimes even 4 times a Sunday. And by the end of the day on Sunday, I had preached 4 different sermons, even though I had the same text. And so it was like every Sunday I encountered the Spirit, because that's how I felt carried by the Spirit. I never knew what shape it would take. I never knew what shape the sermon would take when I was going to deliver it, because every situation was a different congregation. Yeah. And that shaped how that influenced the Spirit.
I know, like in this particular chapter, there were so many jewels of sentences.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, so many, like, you know.
Yeah.
And I just going through what I had. I mark up my books a lot, right? But I have IMP on so many, so important, and so many of them. Like it's hard to say, like, you know, just which is better than the other. But they're all, you know, equally so good, right? But there was one here, and it's about how pastors are supposed to keep in mind things about the Spirit when they're with patients and so on. And it was number 3 on page 122. I think we've come across something similar to this before. It says a third way of broadening pastoral care so that it includes both self and spirit is to recall that the Spirit's revelation occurs as the Word of God is embodied. God is revealed in both spoken and visible forms. And then he goes on with how that's done, right? And I think we've talked about that
That's
this
chapter
year
2, wasn't
as
it,
well.
or something like that?
Yeah, we talked about that before. But it's the same theme that keeps kind of coming through, right?
Chapter 3, the word.
Hmm?
I think he talked about that.
Chapter 3 was it? Yeah.
The verbal and visible word.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Right on. Thank you, Dean.
Yeah, the visible word can be sacraments, icon. I think this board on the outside here, in the hall there is like an icon. If you look at that, it's a beautiful piece. And yeah, but so is a smile. A warm smile is a visible word.
That's why I have to smile more instead of looking sad.
But being sad when someone is sad can be very empathetic and very.
The idea here on page 123 that the pastor himself, herself, really needs to be open to the Spirit. And I know in my life, in my ministry, finding that time for quiet is very important, because otherwise it would just get chewed up in a flurry of activity. And I think, you know, like we as an organization, I will say, pride ourselves on William Booth's motto that it was all about others. But yet I learned to be quiet from the Roman Catholic sisters.
Yes, exactly.
And we don't teach that. And so Sunday morning, sometimes you feel almost an irreverence to worship. And I often feel bombarded. You know, I thought when we were in Botwood, our office was in the foyer of the church, and everybody kind of came through and brought their laundry with them sometimes. And sometimes you were walking into the pulpit feeling very beat up and certainly not ready to share a word. And we come here and our office is downstairs, and we thought, okay, well, this will probably provide a quiet place, but it doesn't happen in our church. And so if you don't purposefully and intentionally find that time, because certainly if you want to call Sunday a Sabbath, is not a Sabbath.
No, it's not.
It's the worst work day of the week. And so you really have to, but it's easy to get caught up in activities and demands that you ignore your own spirit.
Yeah.
And
stay for the Spirit of God.
Yeah. And I guess I've been reading about clergy burnout. And a lot of that probably is our own doing, that we actually don't seek. And I think that's what I was talking about tonight. You know, when it comes to, we're comprised of 3 parts, but even many pastors don't delve into their spirit.
No.
And it's a real shame, because you feed people on empty and they get crumbs.
Yeah. leftovers. Yeah.
So thanks, Janice. I think you had the last word. Unless people want to continue. You had an extra hour's sleep the night before, so. Any questions or comments before we pull it to a close?
Next chapter's a long one.
Suffering, is it? We're going to suffer through that one?
We'll suffer through that one, yeah.
I thank you all for accommodating my schedule, and I really appreciate being able to do the class tonight instead of trying to fit it in on Wednesday nights. So much appreciated.
No problem.
And I'd like to thank everyone for accommodating me.
Well, that's it was worth having it tonight. Thank you, and I think it certainly complemented the theme of teaching, and it was good presentation. Thank you, Harold. And thank you to Elizabeth and Laura for being on as well, and Taylor in her absence, who had to leave earlier.
Are we doing suffering next time?
We're doing suffering next time, and Miles is presenting. I haven't received his article yet, so I don't know what that will be like. So, the theme of suffering. Good night.
Good night, all.
Night.